I said, no, thank you. I don't want to be a CFO. I love being a controller. And he paused and he said, well, I didn't really consider that you might say no.
Hi, Calvin. Thank you so much for being on my podcast today. We have a very special guest, the CEO of New York State CPA. So, Calvin, can you please just introduce a little bit to our audience about yourself?
Absolutely, and Rosie, thanks so much for having me here. I'm a big fan of what you're doing, so I'm really excited to be here. But yeah, Calvin Harris, CPA and CEO of New York State Society of CPAs. I am excited to be in this role because New York is where the CPA credential began. The very first CPA was here in New York, and New York State Society of CPAs, or NYCPA, is also the first CPA society. So I'm really honored to be in this role as its CEO.
Wow, it has a rich history.
Yes. Yes, yes. I jokingly say, but it just happens to be true, that the CPA credential began in New York just a few years after electricity. When when there were the first CPAs, there was not electricity in all of Manhattan. There was only electricity 5 years before that in Lower Manhattan, near Wall Street. So that's how old we are, where CPAs were using candlelight.
Wow. I'm looking forward to a lot of amazing stories during the podcast today. So, Calvin, let's start from the beginning. I know it's a long time ago, but
It
from
is.
the beginning, when you chose accounting major,
Yeah.
why did you choose this career? Why did you choose this accounting major?
Yeah. Well, first, you're right. It was a long time ago because I was a child, and my late mother, was a high school bookkeeping teacher. She also taught typing, which I'm not sure there are typing teachers in high schools anymore. But I remember her bringing home textbooks that she would tell her to give her students, and I was one of those kids that would read darn near anything. So I was reading textbooks, and I was pretty good at math. First stereotype is, of course, you don't have to be good at math at all to be a good accountant and be a good CPA. But I was pretty good at math, and I liked business, so I had an inclination of becoming an accountant when I was a child, and my high school had a bookkeeping or an accounting class there, so I took high school bookkeeping. So by the time I was in college, when I joined college, I knew I wanted to be an accounting major. I knew I wanted to be a CPA. So for me, it was, we talk about how important it is to engage young people early. I was engaged very early because it was literally at home to where I first became involved and interested in becoming an accountant.
So, when you look at your mom's accounting book when you were so
Yeah.
little, what made you so interested in those bookkeeping information?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at least back then, and this is still tracks, I suppose, even as a much older person. Uh, I enjoyed the problem solving. It seemed to me as a child, what I was looking at was basically problem solving. I was looking at these numbers and double entry accounting. On one side should equal the other side, and you have to do whatever it takes to make sure that they equal. So that part really intrigued me because it was a way of taking math in a way that I wasn't used to. And it didn't hurt that there were dollar signs in front of it. So now it's not just math, but there's money involved. So now we're talking. So I think those are the parts that really caught my eye as much as anything. It was problem solving, and it was actual money in place. It wasn't just no offense to mathematicians, but it wasn't just theoretical things. They were things that are are actual currency. So that definitely caught my attention.
You also mentioned that you're interested in business. So,
Yeah,
between accounting major and finance major, finance also related to business.
yeah.
Why did you not go with finance when it can help you for the business in the future?
Yeah, well, a few things came up from there. I had read, and I'm not even sure if this is true, but I'm going to pretend it's true if it's not. I remember reading in, I think maybe middle school, junior high school, maybe high school, that there were more leaders, CEOs, and whatnot that had accounting backgrounds than other business backgrounds. And then when you couple that with me enjoying my high school accounting classes, I was like, this is definitely the one. And I figured, and it turned out to be true, that with any business major, you were going to still take some finance and marketing and a number of other classes, and but none of them really resonated with me as much as accounting did. So I never really veered off for it. I did for a very brief period of time consider being a music minor. I did think about that, but I also realized that there was no way I could get that minor without an additional year in school. Which full disclosure, I became a CPA years before there was any sort of requirement or discussion on 150 hours or master's degree. So I have a bachelor's. But I never thought about anything other than accounting degree as my main major.
Wow. So does that mean that you can sing at the end of the podcast discussion?
Well, it depends on how. If anybody wants a headache, then yes, I can sing. But my main music was instrumental. I grew up playing the saxophone from, gosh, age 9 until technically now I have a saxophone at home. Not many people know this because they most people haven't seen me play it before, but I don't play it very often. At least not as much as I probably should. But yeah, I grew up playing the saxophone, clarinet a little bit. So even to the point, random fact, I actually have a saxophone tattooed on my arm. So that's how much I love the saxophone.
You really love it.
Yeah, I
Oh
really love the
my
saxophone.
God.
Yeah, yeah,
If you have saxophone next to you,
yeah.
we would love to see you play.
Yeah, well, I'd say if we were recording this at home, I'm in my office here in New York City on Madison Avenue. But if we were at home, I actually would be within just arm's length of the sax, so we could see if I still know what I'm doing. But but yeah,
For another interview and just to
you never know. We'll,
I
we'll see.
know.
We can always see.
I know, right? And so after you graduate from college with
Yeah,
accounting degree,
yeah.
did you go with audit or did you go with tax?
I went with audit. I did have a bit of a thought in terms of whether I was going to be in private industry or public accounting. My junior internship was with Amoco. Amoco, as far as I know, doesn't really exist. They were acquired by British Petroleum, BP, many, many, many years ago. But I had an internship with there, which I very much enjoyed. I thought it was a great experience, and I had an offer from them to work within their headquarters in Chicago. At the same time, there was discussion with public accounting, and I was mainly looking at Arthur Anderson, where I ended up working, and two others. And then there was another private or another industry organization, chemical company had an opening in their internal audit department in St. Louis. Big company, multinational, which I've probably said enough to where you can figure out who that was. But in the end, much of it, admittedly, through the recommendations of my faculty and faculty advisors, ended up going to public accounting. Arthur Anderson had an amazing experience. I really enjoyed beginning my career that way. But it really was a great way to start my career.
So when you start as an auditor, what did you learn the most from that position?
Great question. So, and yeah, you're right. I didn't say that part. I did start in audit versus tax. I think what I learned as much as anything was I found it interesting how much of what I had learned in college immediately showed up in work. which I didn't realize out there. Not everything. I mean, because of the sort of clients I had, some of my accounting classes were more relevant than others. The auditing class was very relevant, but I thought it was so interesting that I am just out of college, and here I am going into these organizations with these grown-ups, and I'm supposed to be auditing them and telling them what to do. That was a really big adjustment for me. That, I'm coming out of college, I'm 21, 22 years old, and I'm working with these people who are so much older than me. I admittedly struggled for a very long time when I had, partners and managers who insisted I call them by their first name. I was like, what do you mean I'm calling you by your first? Just call me Jim. I said, well, I'm not calling you Jim. that's so they're culturally that's not what I learned. I say you address someone that's older than you by their last name or whatnot. So I think as much as anything, the work was challenging, but was really fun. What I thought was so interesting, and it's one of those things that my school actually prepared me very well for this. So shout out to the career development office at Morehouse College. But I realized so many of the things that allow someone to be successful in their career, and I still believe this to this day. You always have to know the work. You can't fake that. If you're an auditor, you need to understand auditing. You need to understand your industry. But so much of what will make you ultimately successful goes beyond the things you're going to learn in college. At least in the textbooks, that's got to be your base. That's got to be where you start. But so much of it comes down with your ability to work well with others, to be collaborative, to work in a good teamwork. If you're a leader, to be an engaging leader. So many of the things that ultimately lead to success that were really eye-opening for me were the things that I learned, not necessarily in some classes, but when I had to do a teamwork assignment. I really did not like working, and I like it now, but I did not like in school when they put you on a team. I was like, why do I need to work on a team? I know what I'm doing. Why do I need to worry about these? But that ends up being one of the most important things to do, because if far more often than not, when you do work, you will be working with other people. You will not be working off to the side by yourself. Sometimes, yes, but more often than not, you need to interact with people. So I realized that a lot of the things that I found admittedly frustrating as a college student served a really important purpose. So I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I didn't blow it off. I'm glad that. But it was a big eye opening. It's a real huge transition when you're going from college to the workforce, and I still believe that we need to be as accommodating as we can be, because it's easy to forget how tough that time can be.
Yep, and you mentioned about teamwork,
Yeah,
especially for audit. You have
yeah,
to work so much with your
yeah.
team, not as in tax that you have one tax return, you
Yeah,
finish it, and you move on. And
right,
you probably collaborate with other people in the team if you have any questions.
right.
So for teamwork with tax is way less than in audit. Have you
Yeah.
ever thought that, hey, I do not like to work too much work with a team, maybe I should consider to do tax?
I very, very briefly, but I didn't think it was my strength, to be honest. And it's odd because in college, not that any of the classes were easy, so I'm not saying that, but I think that the tax accounting class, I had the easiest time. I just got it. I was able to do that class quite well. But despite it being the class that gave me the least amount of difficulty, it was, certainly not an easy professor. It just sunk in very well for me. I had no interest in doing that professionally, because I was convinced. Well, this is one of those cases where I listened to the stereotypes, and I probably shouldn't have. To where, oh, if you're taxed, you're just going to sit in this corner, just going to do this. I didn't realize that just how much engagement a good tax preparer does. Even I don't do my own taxes. I engage someone else to do it for me, because I figure that's the best thing to be as impartial as possible. But no, never really considered tax as a track.
That's interesting. I think from my experience, when I was in college, I did so badly for audit class.
Oh,
And when
really?
I took audit exam for the CPA exam, I
Yeah,
took 3 times to pass it. And I
yeah,
still told myself that I'm going to be a great auditor.
yeah.
So when I started for the first year as an auditor, I was like, this is absolutely not for me.
Yeah,
So
I get it. I get it. I do. But there is something to self-talk, positive self-talk. I've made no secret of it. I did not pass the CPA exam the first or the second or the third time I tried. But when I did pass it, I passed all 4 parts in one sitting. That's, back when that was a little more normal. And the difference was, number one, I actually studied, which is embarrassing to say, and just shows that that was just a little silly to think you could pass the CPA exam without studying properly. But when I properly studied, but I also would tell myself I'm going to pass, and I do believe that positive self talk can make a difference.
I agree. That's great. Positive self-talk
Hmm.
is always bring you to the point where you want. So you're not going to give it up
Absolutely,
in the middle of the way.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I
And
completely
so
agree.
yeah. And so when you work as an auditor for many years, you
Yeah,
move up
yeah,
the ladder in your career to
yeah,
become a CFO.
yeah,
So from beginning, very beginning after you graduate, challenging with teamwork, it's the
yeah,
like huge adjustment for after college.
yeah,
Long career become the CFO. During
yeah.
that time, what did you learn the most from become beginning career to become the
Yeah,
CFO?
yeah, great question. Most of the things I learned the best, I learned when I failed. And you never want to struggle. You never want to not do your best. And when I say fail, it's not because there wasn't efforts. It was just like, oh, it was just the wrong approach. Easy example. The very first time I was made a CFO. Actually, even the very first time I became a controller, it was interim. But let's talk about the CFO role. Um, it was at NeighborWorks America, great organization, um, and I was the controller at that organization. It was just after I had worked at a forensic accounting firm, and I decided I wanted to be back internal. It was just a better fit for me at that point, and I was the controller there. Very much enjoyed the organization. Great organization. They do great work. I'm probably biased because I work there, but they do amazing work for the community and for the country. And I was a controller. I loved being a controller. Loved being a controller, and I very much enjoyed my boss, who was the director of finance and administration. I think that was his title. Might be off a little bit, but roughly that's the title. There was no chief financial officer at the organization. Now, the CEO at the time, great individual, Ken Wade, passed away a number of years ago, um, decided that he wanted to have a CFO at the organization. And my boss at the time was not a CPA. Here's a thing where a CPA becomes important. He thought it was important that his CFO was a CPA. My boss at the time was not a CPA. I was a CPA. I was in industry, but I was a CPA. And I remember distinctly, I was on vacation in France. Now, I realize it's hard to think this way, but there was a time when you may not always have your cell phone nearby, and irrespective of where you are in the world, you can be reachable. This was one of those times. We're talking about years ago. And my cell phone was off. I carried it with me to France, but it was off because it was going to cost way too much, and I didn't need anything in there. So I got off the plane in the States from a great trip to France, and there was a voicemail. One of the voicemails was from the CEO of the organization, and in the message, I didn't even hear much, and okay, I'm terrified. This is not good. Then I picked up the next message from the director of HR, good friend of mine, a colleague. Her message to me was to call the CEO, because I knew that the first part of the message I heard from the CEO was that my boss was terminated and he wanted to talk to me. I was like, well, I'm not returning that call. I'm not calling you after this trip to France to find out that I'm fired. So, but he talked to me and he said, I've moved on from your former boss, and I want you to be the interim CFO, and we'll talk about it on Monday. So thinking about it over the weekend. I go to his office and I declined. I said, no, thank you. I don't want to be a CFO. I love being a controller. No, thank you. He said, if you're giving me a choice, the answer is no. And he paused and he said, well, I didn't really consider that you might say no. Why don't you think about it a few days and we'll think about it? I said, but I hadn't really considered anything. So thought about it a few days later. I said, okay, fine, we'll give it a shot. Be a CFO. I was terrible. I was terrible at it for about 3 months. And the reason I was terrible was really quite simple. I was a CFO, but I was still thinking like a controller. And this is nothing against controllers, nothing, they're just very different jobs. As a controller, I needed to be keenly focused on the accounting and very specific transactions on a very detailed level, monthly close, all those things, da 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 da. Da. As CFO, I needed to be concerned with that, but I also needed to be concerned about the overall budget and HR and IT and a few other areas. I wasn't paying any attention to them because I was still thinking like controller. Now, the good news is I had a friend who ultimately actually became a CFO herself. She became a CFO later herself before she retired. And she pulled me aside because now technically she reports to me. And her phrase was, we had a good relationship. She said it harsh, but the way it needed to be said. She's like, Calvin, this isn't going well because you're acting like you're my colleague when you need to be my boss. And I immediately knew what she meant because from that point on, I was like, all right. She's like, Alan is no longer in the role. You're in the role. You need to do the job. And it was admittedly one of, I think there are moments that you end up having over the course of your career, certainly over the course of your life, that end up having a huge impact on it. And that conversation with Rebecca, with Becky, made a huge difference. And I'm hoping I'm paraphrasing right, but it made a huge difference because I didn't realize until she said, you're absolutely right. I'm actually not doing the job. And what's worse is not that I'm not doing the job. I know what I want to do as CFO, but I'm not doing it. So I started doing that. And then as it turns out, much to my surprise, for as much as I like being a controller, I liked being a CFO more. Who knew? Who knew? The moment I actually did, it's like, oh, I like doing this more. I actually like this. Now, I ended up leaving the organization on very good terms, because as it turns out, I interviewed for the CFO role. I didn't get it. It was absolutely the right call. I was still a little junior, I was still a little young. They found a person that was more seasoned. I believe they made the right call. But at that point, I was like, gosh, now that I have a taste of being what a CFO is like, I want that now. you know. So I ended up leaving NeighborWorks on good terms to take another job. And technically I was controller at that other job, although it was CFO equivalent, because my eyes were opened. So my point is that I I learned that lesson well because I was failing originally. And fortunately, I had a colleague and a friend who was not willing to let me fail, partially because she knew me well enough to know that I know this is not what he wants to do as CFO. Maybe I just need to kind of get him going a little bit. So, she did me a really great favor, and calling me out. It wasn't easy to hear. The feedback was really tough to hear, but she was absolutely right. And it wasn't until she was like, you know, do the job the way you want to do the job, that I realized that. And I've never forgotten that story because it's shown up time and time again. It's shown up in this job because this is my first time as a CEO. But I have definite thoughts in terms of the way I think I want to be a CEO, which may be different than other people, and that's perfectly fine. But I think one of the things I've learned over my career, that story is just one example, but it comes up time and time again. You can't be afraid to fail. This is a tough one. I struggle with it too. Um, but you're also going to get some of your best lessons when you try something and it doesn't work. Now, I'm not saying you should be irresponsible and just do things recklessly. That's just silly. But when you look at things and people, when people have achieved things, whether as a group or individually, there's usually some risk there. And as CPAs, we're not necessarily taught to embrace risk. If anything, we're pushed to be risk averse. But I gotta admit, we're probably in a time in the profession where I'm not saying we should be reckless, but we're probably at a time where we need to take on a little bit more risk if we're really going to grow the profession to what it really should be.
Wow, you mentioned about being a CEO at the young age. Can you tell us how old you were at that
Yeah.
time?
And funny enough, these things always seem to be around decades. So the first time I became a controller was I was an interim controller at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. I was 29 when that happened. So I suddenly had about 40 people reporting to me, multi-hundred-million-dollar university. I was a controller.
Wow,
When I
that's so
first
young.
became a CFO in interim, let's see, was I 40? I think I was 39. And then I took on this job. Well, there's a five in front of my number. Yeah, yeah, but it all seems to be. So I'll say the 30s were my decade of controller, and the 40s were my decade of CFO, and then you keep going and you get to CEO. So I guess every 10 years is a shift, it seems.
So that's how we calculate the next step in the career. Got it. I remember.
At least for me, right?
So you mentioned about very good point that
Yeah,
when you were in the CFO and you thought yourself as a controller and you behaved like a controller,
yeah.
did you have anyone replace your controller position when you move up to be a CFO?
Yeah, that's such a good point, Rosie. Because I forgot to mention that one of the things that was critical in me being able to step out of that controller's role and do the work I need to do as CFO was I promoted internally. I took a person that was, I think his title at the time was senior accountant, and I made him the acting controller. So while I was the acting CFO, I made him the acting controller, and I moved everyone who had reported directly to me to him. That ended up being a critical step. One thing I've certainly learned over the years, because I've had the pleasure of leading or being in supervisory roles, gosh, for most of my career now. And I know there's a number that I can't go. Once I go above that number, I'm just not as effective as a leader. And it differs by organization, but more often than not, it seems to be right around six, seven, maybe eight people, to where it's more than that, at least for me. And there are people who I'm sure say, oh, my number's small, and that somebody say, oh, my number's bigger than that. For me, it's right around six to eight. And I will admit, particularly after that experience at NeighborWorks, at every organization I've worked with since, if I find that the number of direct reports is too big, I shift it around a little bit. So even the last job I had in Maryland before I came here to New York, which was at the community college in Baltimore, when I took on that role initially as their acting VP, their acting CFO, I had it was double digits. I think it might have been 13 people who reported to me, which I knew was this is too many people. I can't be effective this way because I won't be able to give people what support. I ended up creating a number two position, brought that person in, and then I moved some people underneath her so that I still had that number. So I've it's important as a leader to know what works best for you. And it's okay to be selfish in this regard, because in this case, you being, quote, selfish as a leader is what's going to let you be a better leader. And the better a leader you are, the better the organization's going to be. I learned that from more than a few of my bosses. I was like, why? Well, this is what works best for me. So I know that I push hard to try to get myself around that six, seven, or eight number. And if I don't have it naturally, I just kind of force my way there to make sure that people are getting what they need.
I like it. How you actually organize the structure a little bit to make it work for yourself.
Yeah,
So you can
yeah,
behave or you can lead people the best of you.
absolutely. Absolutely. What's the phrase? Self care is not selfish, and that applies to the work side as well. I think it's important to know. Pardon me. I think it's important to know what scenario you will work best in, as a leader and as an organization. I mean, we if you look at my background, you'll see that I've worked at quite a few organizations, and the far more than my college advisors would have liked. But in the end, I know what works best, and in every case, they were all good fits. Um, Sometimes success feeds upon itself. I'm fortunate in that many of the jobs I've had over the years are ones to where I was very happy at another organization, and a different organization came through and they made an opportunity that I just felt I had to accept, and had to consider. But it is important. It is very important as a leader, and then if you're not in a leadership role, and if you're just, even if you're just leading yourself, it's important to know yourself as best as possible.
I like how you mentioned about being happy at the job, at your
Yeah,
multiple job. I
yeah,
just have a side question that
yeah,
if you have two options, one job that you are happy with but low salary, but another job that you're not happy with and you have salary, and on the top of that, you have expenses in your life that you have to take care of. It's not like, oh, I just take happy job,
yeah.
low salary, and I don't have to worry much expenses in my life. How do you make the decision in that situation?
Yeah, honestly, this is tough because as easy as it might be, oh, you take the job you like, there is the reality that we have to live. There are expenses we have, there are lifestyles that we may want to maintain, and there are countless people in this country, countless people around the world who are doing jobs that they are not enjoying because they need to take care of their family. I don't want to make it seem like it's that easy a call. So I'll say, if you can make everything work, then you absolutely go with the job that makes you happier. Recognizing that some cases you really don't feel like you have that choice, and that's unfortunate. But I have found in my career that when I've enjoyed the work, I am more successful in what I'm doing. Um, and that doesn't mean I'm not working a lot of hours. This job as CEO has a lot of hours, but I enjoy the work. I love this job, but it takes a lot of time to do. But I find, at least for me, that it tracks. If I'm enjoying the work, I'm better at the work. I can think, and I won't name them, but I can think of two different places where I worked where they were both the best and most challenging experiences of my career. And the only thing that was different were the people I was working with or working for. So I realized there are a lot of components that can come in there. So it's not, you can't just say, oh, well, it's hard to work at this company, it's hard to work at this firm. Usually it's not the company or the firm, it's usually the people you work with. And I realize that people are the company, people are the firm. But all, all other things being equal, and as long as you can take care of your lifestyle and your family, to then you absolutely would go with the job that makes you happy. If for no other reason than, if you're in the job that makes you happy, you'll probably put yourself in a position to get a better thing. And if you take the job that makes you unhappy, it's usually not tenable. People tend not to burn out from jobs they love. I mean, it happens, but when I hear people, "Oh, I'm burnt out," well, you're in something that's not connecting with you. It's not connecting with you on a personal level. That's why you're burning out. Um, I'm no therapist, but from what I see, that when I think of colleagues and friends that have burnt out, in every single case, they were in a job that was problematic. They either had a rough boss, or they just didn't really like the work, or in some cases, they were exceptional at the work, but they really didn't like it. And it just wasn't connecting with them. So I think it's important. We often have to spend so much time and so much of a part of our lives doing these jobs, to where if you have any possibility of finding work that connects with you, you owe it to yourself to be in that kind of situation, because a lot of people don't even have that kind of luxury. You know, I can remember, years and years and years ago, many, many decades ago, when I was doing work with a moving company because I couldn't afford to go to school. I did not want to do that work at all. And it's honorable work, but I just wasn't enjoying it in the end. And it's the sort of thing that would have absolutely burned me out. So I think if you have the opportunity, you owe it to yourself to be in a work environment that connects with you personally and makes you happy.
So a good solution for the salary is that if you have the CPA license, you can boost the salary up.
That is true. That is true. There's more than a few data points that show how, we obviously have some work to do on starting salaries. There is no doubt about that. But the CPA does track pretty well as you go further and further. I will freely admit it never occurred to me, and I thought I was pretty engaged in terms of what a CPA could do. It never Some of the opportunities that have come my way, both in terms of the job and also the compensation components, it never occurred to me that those things were possible, even as a CPA. So the financial rewards, I'll say, are significant, and we certainly could do a better job of putting it out there.